In the rolling hills southeast of Atlanta, where the red Georgia clay meets ancient oak trees draped in Spanish moss, and where the distant thunder of Union cannons mingles with church bells calling the faithful to Easter service, there lies buried a tale that no Confederate newspaper dared to print. The year was 1863 when spring arrived early to Magnolia Grove Plantation, painting the dogwood trees white as fallen angels, and filling the air with the sweet perfume of wisteria that could not mask the bitter scent of approaching war. Before we journey deeper into this tale of calculated vengeance and bitter justice, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. On this holiest of Sundays, when Christians across the war-torn South gathered to celebrate resurrection and renewal, 16 souls would discover that some sins demand a different kind of salvation. What began as an elegant Easter dinner in the grand tradition of Southern hospitality would end with the kind of justice that courts could never deliver, and laws could never recognize. The authorities who arrived the following dawn would find themselves confronting a mystery that defied medical explanation, a tragedy that seemed to mock the very notion of divine mercy. But the answer to their questions lay not in the hands of an angry God, but in the calloused palms of a 19-year-old woman who had learned that sometimes the meek inherit the earth only after they stop waiting for inheritance and start taking what justice demands. This is the story of Elena Marchetti, a young cook who discovered that the kitchen could be transformed into a courtroom, that Easter dinner could become a final judgment, and that resurrection sometimes requires a reckoning with the dead. Her weapons were not guns or knives, but knowledge passed down through generations of women who understood that nature provides its own forms of justice for those patient enough to learn her secrets. Her battlefield was not Gettysburg or Antietam, but a dining room where crystal glasses caught the light of silver candelabras, and where the finest families of Georgia gathered to celebrate life, never suspecting they were attending their own wake. The Magnolia Grove Plantation stretched across nearly 3,000 acres of the richest farmland in DeKalb County, its boundaries marked by ancient stone walls that had witnessed the rise and fall of 2 generations of the Whitmore family. The main house rose from the landscape like a monument to Southern prosperity, its white columns gleaming in the afternoon sun, and its wraparound porches offering sweeping views of cotton fields that rolled toward the horizon like a green ocean dotted with the bent backs of those whose labor had built this empire of comfort and privilege. Colonel Harrison Whitmore had inherited the property from his father in 1845, and in the 18 years since he had transformed it from a modest farming operation into one of the most profitable plantations in the region. Unlike some of his neighbors who relied solely on cotton, Whitmore had diversified his holdings to include tobacco, corn, and a small but lucrative operation breeding horses for the Confederate cavalry. His business acumen had made him wealthy, but it was his reputation for maintaining order through what he called enlightened discipline that had earned him respect among his peers and fear among the 140 souls he owned. The colonel was a man of average height but commanding presence, with steel-gray hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of his domain. He dressed always in the manner of a gentleman, favoring dark suits even in the Georgia heat, and carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he truly wanted. His philosophy of slave management was simple and, to his mind, humane. He provided adequate food, decent quarters, and even allowed limited religious instruction, believing that content slaves were productive slaves. He rarely resorted to the whip, preferring to use the threat of family separation as his primary tool of control, a method he considered both effective and merciful. His wife Victoria had brought to the marriage not only her considerable dowry from one of Charleston's oldest families, but also her refined tastes and social connections that had elevated the Whitmores from mere successful planters to true Southern aristocracy. She was a delicate woman of 45 with prematurely silver hair and the pale complexion that Southern ladies cultivated as a mark of their refinement. Victoria spent her days overseeing the domestic operations of the plantation, planning elaborate entertainments, and maintaining the extensive correspondence that kept the family connected to the wider world of Confederate society. She had a particular gift for hospitality that made Magnolia Grove a destination for the region's most influential families, and her dinner parties were legendary throughout Georgia for their elegance and the quality of their cuisine. The Whitmore children had been raised in the manner befitting their station, with private tutors, extensive libraries, and the assumption that the world existed primarily for their benefit. Benjamin, the eldest at 24, had recently returned from his studies at the University of Virginia, where he had distinguished himself more for his skill at cards and his appetite for questionable entertainments than for any academic achievements. He was a tall, handsome young man with his father's pale eyes and his mother's aristocratic features, but where his parents maintained at least the facade of paternalistic concern for their human property, Benjamin regarded the slaves with the casual indifference one might show toward livestock. Sophia, at 22, was considered one of the most beautiful young women in the county, with dark hair and expressive brown eyes that had captured the attention of William Ashford, the eldest son of a prominent Savannah family. Their engagement had been announced the previous Christmas, and the upcoming wedding promised to unite two of Georgia's most influential planting dynasties. Sophia possessed her mother's social graces and her father's shrewd intelligence, but she had also inherited something else, a streak of cruelty that manifested itself in small acts of deliberate unkindness toward those who could not retaliate. Catherine, the middle daughter at 18, was perhaps the most complex of the Whitmore children. She possessed an artistic temperament that had led her to pursue painting and music with genuine passion, and she sometimes displayed an uncomfortable awareness of the moral contradictions inherent in their way of life. Yet even her occasional qualms about slavery never translated into any meaningful challenge to the system that provided her comfort, and she had learned to suppress her doubts in favor of social conformity. James, the youngest at 16, showed promise of becoming the most dangerous of the Whitmore offspring. Too young to have developed his siblings' veneer of social sophistication, he displayed a pure, unfiltered cruelty that troubled even his parents. He had already shown an alarming tendency to torture small animals, and had been known to devise elaborate punishments for slaves who displeased him, punishments that his father tolerated as the natural exuberance of a high-spirited boy. The plantation's daily operations were overseen by Marcus Webb, a sharp-faced man in his 30s who had risen from overseer to trusted lieutenant through his willingness to employ whatever methods necessary to maintain discipline and productivity. Webb understood that his position depended entirely on the Whitmores' continued satisfaction with his results, and he had cultivated a reputation for ruthless efficiency that made even the most rebellious slaves think twice about challenging his authority. He carried himself with the swagger of a man who knew that his white skin gave him power over people who might be smarter, stronger, and more capable than himself, and he used that power with the vindictive pleasure of someone who had been powerless for much of his own life. The slave quarters at Magnolia Grove consisted of two parallel rows of wooden cabins that housed the plantation's workforce in conditions that Whitmore considered generous by the standards of the time. Each cabin contained 2 rooms and housed anywhere from 4 to 8 people depending on family size and current population. The quarters had their own social hierarchy, with skilled workers like the blacksmith, carpenter, and head cook enjoying slightly better accommodations and marginally more freedom of movement. At the center of this community stood a small wooden chapel where the slaves were permitted to hold religious services under the supervision of a white minister, who carefully vetted all sermons to ensure they contained nothing that might encourage thoughts of freedom or resistance. It was into this world that Elena had arrived 15 years earlier, an 8-year-old girl sold along with her mother from a failing tobacco plantation in Virginia. Her mother, Maria, had died of fever during Elena's second winter at Magnolia Grove, leaving the child to be raised by the plantation's head cook, an elderly woman known to everyone as Mama Esperanza. Esperanza had been born in freedom in Spanish Florida.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Kidnapped as a young woman and sold into slavery, and she carried within her memories of a different world and knowledge that had been passed down through generations of women who understood that survival sometimes required more than mere endurance. Under Esperanza's tutelage, Elena had learned not only the art of cooking, but also the more dangerous art of thinking. The old woman had recognized something special in the girl, an intelligence and determination that could be either a blessing or a curse depending on how it was channeled. In the long winter evenings, when the kitchen was finally quiet and the main house settled into sleep, Esperanza had shared with Elena the stories of her people, tales of resistance and survival that were never spoken aloud in daylight. More importantly, she had taught Elena about the plants that grew wild in the Georgia countryside, their properties and their potential uses. Some were for healing, she explained, showing Elena how to prepare poultices and teas that could ease pain and fight infection. Others had different purposes, darker applications that she described only in whispers, and only after extracting solemn promises of secrecy. Elena had also received an education that would have shocked the Whitmores had they known of it. Father O'Sullivan, the Irish priest who occasionally visited the plantation to minister to the few Catholic slaves, had recognized Elena's quick mind, and had quietly taught her to read and write, using a hidden primer and conducting lessons in the chapel while supposedly hearing confessions. This knowledge had opened new worlds to Elena, allowing her to read discarded newspapers and overheard letters, giving her access to information and ideas that most slaves never encountered. She learned about the wider world beyond Magnolia Grove, about the war that was reshaping the South, and about the growing movement of people who believed that slavery was not the natural order of things but a system that could and should be changed. By the time Elena reached her 15th birthday, she had become Mama Esperanza's unofficial successor, though the old woman retained the title of head cook until her death 3 years later. Elena possessed an almost supernatural gift for cooking, able to transform the simplest ingredients into dishes that drew praise even from the discriminating palates of the Whitmore family's guests. She had developed her own network of sources for rare spices and unusual ingredients, trading favors with other plantation cooks and occasionally receiving gifts from traveling merchants who appreciated her skill. Her reputation had spread throughout the county, and invitations to dine at Magnolia Grove were sought after partly because of the certainty that the meal would be exceptional. When Elena was 16, she had married Miguel Marchetti, the plantation's blacksmith, in a ceremony that was as elaborate as slave marriages were permitted to be. Miguel was a quiet, serious man of 25 who had been born on the plantation, and had inherited his father's position and skills. He was one of the few slaves who had any real security in his position, since skilled blacksmiths were valuable and difficult to replace, especially during wartime when metalwork was in constant demand. Their marriage had been blessed with 3 children in quick succession: Isabella, now 8, Carlos, 6, and little Rosa, who had just turned 4. Elena's children were the center of her world, the bright spots in a life that was otherwise defined by service to others. She had managed to arrange for them to spend their days in the kitchen area where she could watch over them while working, teaching them letters and numbers when time permitted and filling their young minds with stories that would help them understand their worth as human beings regardless of what the law might say about their status. Isabella had inherited her mother's quick intelligence and had already begun helping with simple kitchen tasks, while Carlos showed signs of his father's mechanical aptitude and loved to watch Miguel work at the forge. Rosa was still too young for serious work, but had developed a precocious ability to charm even the sternest overseers with her bright smile and innocent questions. The family lived in one of the larger cabins, a privilege Elena had earned through her indispensable role in maintaining the plantation's reputation for hospitality. The cabin had been modified over the years to include a small herb garden, where Elena grew both culinary and medicinal plants, and a root cellar that served as storage for her more sensitive ingredients. It was a modest life, but within the constraints of slavery, it was as good as could be reasonably expected. Elena had even begun to allow herself to hope that the war might bring changes that would improve their circumstances, perhaps even eventual freedom if the rumors about President Lincoln's intentions proved true. This fragile happiness had been shattered on a rain-soaked evening in March when Benjamin Whitmore had decided to amuse himself by terrorizing 3 small children, who had been playing near the kitchen garden, while their mother finished preparations for the evening meal. Elena had been working late, preparing preserves for a shipment of early spring vegetables, when she heard her children's frightened voices outside. By the time she reached the door, Benjamin had already accused them of stealing candy that had been prepared for the upcoming Easter celebration, a charge that was both false and absurd, since Elena maintained strict control over all kitchen supplies and her children knew better than to touch anything without permission. But Benjamin was drunk and looking for entertainment, and the truth was irrelevant to his purposes. Over Elena's desperate protests and despite her explanations that the children had been under her direct supervision all evening, he had ordered Marcus Webb to lock all 3 children in the root cellar as punishment for their alleged theft. The cellar was little more than a hole in the ground covered by wooden planks, designed to keep vegetables cool and dry but never intended to hold human beings. Elena had begged, had offered to take their punishment herself, had promised to work extra hours without pay, but Benjamin had been adamant that the children needed to learn proper respect for their betters. The storm that rolled through that night was one of the worst anyone could remember, with lightning that turned the sky white and shook the ground like cannon fire. The rain fell in torrents, flooding low-lying areas, and turning peaceful streams into raging torrents. By morning, the root cellar had filled with water, and when Webb finally opened it at Benjamin's casual instruction, they found 3 small bodies that would never again run through the kitchen garden, or listen to their mother's stories or dream of better days ahead. Elena's scream when she saw her children's bodies had been heard throughout the quarters, a sound of such raw anguish that it had silenced even the morning birds, and brought slaves running from their cabins to see what catastrophe had befallen them. She had fallen to her knees in the mud, gathering her children's lifeless forms to her chest and keening with a grief so profound that even some of the white overseers had turned away in discomfort. Miguel had arrived moments later, his face draining of color as he comprehended the enormity of their loss, and together they had held their children while the rain continued to fall around them. Benjamin's response to the tragedy had been to shrug and suggest that Elena should be more careful about supervising her children in the future. When Webb had pointed out that the cellar door had been locked from the outside, and that the children could not possibly have entered voluntarily, Benjamin had claimed that they must have been hiding inside when the storm began, and had been trapped by debris. Colonel Whitmore, faced with the choice between believing his son's obvious lie, or admitting that a member of his family had committed what amounted to murder, had chosen to accept Benjamin's version of events, and had forbidden any further discussion of the matter. The official story became that the Marchetti children had drowned in a tragic accident, while playing too close to the swollen creek during the storm. No investigation was conducted, no punishment was administered, and no compensation was offered to the grieving parents. Elena was expected to return to work the following day as if nothing had happened, to continue preparing meals for the family that had murdered her children, and to smile and curtsy when serving the very people responsible for her devastating loss. It was during the long sleepless night after the funeral, as she sat in her empty cabin, listening to Miguel's quiet weeping, that Elena had made her decision. She would not accept this injustice, would not allow her children's deaths to be dismissed as merely the cost of maintaining proper discipline. She would find a way to exact justice that the law would never provide, and she would do it in a manner that ensured everyone understood exactly why it was happening, and who was responsible for bringing it about. Elena Marchetti, the grieving mother and skilled cook, died that night along with Isabella, Carlos and Rosa. In her place arose something new and infinitely more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose, armed with knowledge that could kill and motivated by a thirst for justice that would not be satisfied until every person responsible for her children's deaths had paid the ultimate price for their crimes against innocent souls who had never harmed anyone in their brief, bright lives. In the days that followed the drowning of Elena's children, the true scale of what had occurred began to reveal itself to those who understood how to read the signs that the powerful preferred to keep hidden. The morning after the bodies were discovered, Dr. Charles Brennan arrived at Magnolia Grove in response to Colonel Whitmore's summons, ostensibly to examine the children and provide an official cause of death that would satisfy any potential inquiries from county authorities. Brennan was a man who had built his considerable reputation on his discretion as much as his medical skill, understanding that the continued prosperity of families like the Whitmores depended on maintaining certain fictions about the nature of life and death on southern plantations. The examination Dr. Brennan conducted was perfunctory at best, lasting less than 20 minutes, and consisting primarily of a visual inspection that confirmed the obvious fact that the children had drowned. He made careful notes about water in their lungs and the absence of any obvious external injuries, observations that would support the official narrative of accidental death by misadventure. What he did not note, because he was not looking for it, and because no one had asked him to consider it, was the evidence of prolonged terror visible in the children's final expressions, or the scratches on their small hands that suggested they had clawed desperately at the wooden walls of their underground prison before the water rose too high for them to continue fighting. When Dr. Brennan filed his report with the county coroner, it contained exactly the conclusions that Colonel Whitmore had expected. 3 slave children had died tragically but accidentally during a severe storm, victims of their own poor judgment in seeking shelter in a location that proved dangerous when the weather turned violent. The report mentioned nothing about locked doors or deliberate confinement, nothing about the impossibility of 3 small children voluntarily entering a root cellar and somehow managing to trap themselves inside. It was a masterpiece of omission and misdirection, the kind of document that allowed everyone involved to sleep peacefully while maintaining the comfortable fiction that what had occurred was merely one of those unfortunate accidents that sometimes befell the lower classes. But the slaves of Magnolia Grove knew better, and within hours of the discovery, a different version of events had spread through the quarters like wildfire. Sarah, one of Elena's kitchen assistants, had seen Benjamin dragging the children toward the cellar while their mother worked inside, unaware of the drama unfolding in her own backyard. Tom, the stable hand, had witnessed Marcus Webb turning the key in the cellar door and pocketing it with a satisfaction that suggested this was not the first time he had imprisoned slaves as punishment for imaginary crimes. Most damning of all, several people had heard Benjamin laughing as he walked away from the cellar, making jokes about teaching proper respect to the next generation of slaves. The unofficial investigation conducted by the slave community was far more thorough than anything Dr. Brennan had attempted. They examined the cellar door and found scratches on the inside where desperate fingers had tried to claw through solid wood. They measured the water level and calculated how long it would have taken to rise high enough to drown 3 children who would have been standing on their toes trying to keep their heads above the surface. They interviewed anyone who had seen or heard anything unusual during the storm, building a timeline that made it impossible to believe that the deaths had been accidental. Most importantly, they understood what Elena herself had grasped immediately, that this was not an isolated incident of cruelty, but part of a pattern of escalating violence that Benjamin had been displaying since his return from university. There had been other punishments, other slaves who had suffered under his creative interpretations of discipline, other families who had been terrorized for his entertainment. The difference was that this time he had gone too far, had crossed a line from mere cruelty into outright murder, and had done so in a way that threatened the entire community with the realization that none of them were safe from his whims. Elena observed all of this investigation and discussion from a distance, saying nothing but absorbing every detail with the focused intensity of a scholar studying a complex theorem. She had not spoken since the morning she discovered her children's bodies, communicating only through nods and gestures when absolutely necessary and otherwise maintaining a silence that made even hardened overseers uncomfortable. Miguel worried that his wife's mind had been broken by grief, but those who looked closely could see that Elena's silence was not the empty quiet of madness, but the concentrated stillness of someone engaged in intense mental activity. In the slave quarters, whispered conversations began to turn toward questions of retaliation and resistance. Some of the younger men spoke boldly about confronting Benjamin directly, about making him pay for what he had done regardless of the consequences to themselves. Others advocated for running away to Union lines, abandoning a plantation where children could be murdered with impunity, and where justice would never be served through legal channels. The older slaves counseled patience and caution, pointing out that any direct action would only result in more deaths and greater suffering for everyone who remained behind. But Elena was thinking beyond the crude options of direct confrontation or desperate flight. In the long hours of sleepless nights that followed her children's burial, she found herself remembering conversations with Mama Esperanza about the different forms that resistance could take, lessons about patience and planning that had seemed merely theoretical when she was younger, but now carried the urgent weight of personal necessity. The old woman had often spoken about the power that came from being underestimated, about the advantages available to those who were dismissed as harmless and simple-minded by their oppressors. The more Elena considered her situation, the more she realized that she possessed resources and opportunities that made her uniquely positioned to exact the kind of justice that no court would ever provide. She had access to the Whitmore family's most intimate moments, preparing their food and overhearing their conversations and learning their secrets with the invisibility that came from being seen as merely another piece of household equipment. She had knowledge of plants and their properties that could be used for purposes far removed from mere cooking. Most importantly, she had time to plan and prepare, since no one suspected that the quiet, grief-stricken cook might be capable of anything more dangerous than burning a pot of soup. The transformation that began in Elena during those dark March nights was not visible to casual observation, but Miguel noticed subtle changes that filled him with both hope and fear. His wife had stopped weeping, which might have been a sign of healing, except that she had also stopped displaying any emotion whatsoever, moving through her daily routines with mechanical precision that suggested her mind was occupied with thoughts far removed from the immediate tasks at hand. She had begun working longer hours in the kitchen, staying up late to organize supplies and plan menus with an attention to detail that exceeded even her normally high standards. More troubling to Miguel was Elena's renewed interest in the herb garden behind their cabin, where she had begun spending hours tending to plants that had nothing to do with cooking, and everything to do with the darker knowledge that Mama Esperanza had passed down to her. She had started making frequent trips to the marshlands at the eastern edge of the plantation, returning with specimens that she dried carefully and stored in small containers that she kept locked in a wooden box that had once held her few personal treasures. When Miguel asked about her new botanical interests, Elena would simply nod and change the subject, making it clear that this was not a topic she was prepared to discuss. The first concrete sign that Elena was planning something more significant than mere grief management came when she began asking careful questions about the Whitmore family's upcoming social calendar. Victoria Whitmore had been planning an elaborate Easter celebration for months, an event that would showcase both the family's continued prosperity despite the war and their confidence in the ultimate victory of the Confederate cause. The guest list included some of the most prominent families in the region, people whose presence would demonstrate that the Whitmores remained at the center of Georgia's social and political elite. Elena's inquiries about the Easter dinner were subtle and seemingly innocent, focusing on practical matters of menu planning and supply procurement that were entirely within her legitimate area of responsibility. She asked about dietary preferences and food allergies among the expected guests, about special requests that might require unusual ingredients or extended preparation time. She studied the formal seating chart that Victoria had drawn up, memorizing who would sit where and which dishes would be served to which guests. To anyone observing her preparations, Elena appeared to be taking exceptional care to ensure that the Easter dinner would be a memorable occasion that reflected well on her skills and the plantation's reputation for hospitality. What no one realized was that Elena was indeed planning to make the Easter dinner memorable, but not in the way that anyone expected. She had identified the perfect opportunity to address the injustice that had been done to her family, a chance to ensure that those responsible for her children's deaths would face consequences that matched the magnitude of their crimes. The religious symbolism of Easter was not lost on her. If this was to be a celebration of resurrection and renewal, then she would provide a different kind of resurrection, one that brought her children's voices back to speak truth about the evil that had been done to them. Colonel Harrison Whitmore had ruled over Magnolia Grove for nearly 2 decades with the absolute authority of a medieval lord, dispensing favor and punishment according to his own judgment, and recognizing no higher authority than his own will. He was a man who prided himself on his rationality and his ability to make difficult decisions without being swayed by sentiment or emotion, qualities that he believed essential for anyone responsible for managing large numbers of slaves and maintaining productivity in an inherently unstable system. The colonel's study was the nerve center of his empire, a book-lined sanctuary where he conducted business correspondence, reviewed financial records, and made the countless decisions required to keep a major plantation operating smoothly. The walls were decorated with portraits of distinguished ancestors and maps showing the extent of his holdings, visual reminders of the legacy he had inherited and his responsibility to preserve and expand it for future generations. His desk was always perfectly organized, with separate sections for different types of correspondence, and a complex filing system that allowed him to track everything from crop yields to slave births to market prices for various commodities. It was from this study that Colonel Whitmore had issued the order forbidding any further discussion of the circumstances surrounding the deaths of Elena's children, a decision that he justified to himself as necessary for maintaining discipline and preventing the spread of dangerous ideas among his slave population. He understood that slaves were naturally inclined towards superstition and conspiracy theories, and he could not allow them to transform a tragic accident into some kind of martyrdom narrative that might inspire future acts of rebellion or resistance. The colonel had been troubled by some aspects of his son's account of the evening's events, particularly Benjamin's obvious intoxication and his inability to provide a coherent explanation for why 3 well-behaved children would have chosen to hide in a root cellar during a thunderstorm. But he also understood that questioning Benjamin's story too closely would open doors that were better left closed, creating doubt about his family's credibility and potentially exposing them all to legal scrutiny that could prove embarrassing or worse. Better to accept the official version of events and move forward, trusting that time would diminish the importance of this unfortunate incident. What Colonel Whitmore failed to grasp was that his decision to suppress investigation and discussion of his grandchildren's deaths had made him an active participant in their murder rather than merely a bystander who had arrived too late to prevent tragedy. By choosing to protect Benjamin rather than pursue justice, he had transformed himself from a potentially sympathetic figure into a legitimate target for retribution. Elena understood this distinction perfectly, and her plans for Easter Sunday reflected her recognition that the colonel's guilt was perhaps even greater than his son's, since he possessed the authority to deliver justice and had consciously chosen not to use it. The colonel's wife, Victoria, represented a different but equally culpable form of complicity in the system that had murdered Elena's children. She had built her entire identity around her role as the gracious hostess and refined lady of the plantation, cultivating an image of delicate femininity that allowed her to remain willfully ignorant of the brutalities that sustained her comfortable lifestyle. Victoria had perfected the art of selective attention, managing to live for decades in close proximity to slavery without ever acknowledging the violence and exploitation that made her dinner parties and social gatherings possible. When Victoria learned of the deaths of Elena's children, her primary concern had been ensuring that the tragedy would not interfere with her plans for the Easter celebration. She had worried that Elena might be too grief-stricken to perform her duties adequately, and had even considered hiring temporary help from town to ensure that the quality of the meal would meet her exacting standards. The possibility that her own family might bear responsibility for the deaths had never seriously occurred to her, since acknowledging such a possibility would have required her to confront truths about her life that she had spent years learning to ignore. Victoria's particular contribution to the system that oppressed Elena and her family lay in her creation and maintenance of the social framework that made slavery seem natural and inevitable. Through her dinner parties and social gatherings, she helped to normalize and celebrate a way of life that depended on treating human beings as property. Her gracious hospitality and refined manners provided a veneer of civilization that obscured the violence and cruelty that lay beneath the surface of plantation society. In Elena's mind, Victoria was guilty not of active cruelty but of something perhaps worse, the creation of a cultural environment in which cruelty could flourish while being disguised as genteel tradition. Benjamin Whitmore had returned from his university studies with his worst impulses reinforced rather than tempered by education, having spent 4 years in the company of other young men who shared his assumptions about racial superiority and his taste for exercising power over those who could not resist. The University of Virginia in the 1850s was less an institution of learning than a finishing school for future plantation owners, a place where the sons of the Southern elite learned to articulate and defend the philosophical foundations of slavery while indulging in the kinds of behavior that would prepare them for lives of absolute authority over other human beings. Benjamin had distinguished himself at university not through academic achievement but through his participation in secret societies that specialized in what they called the scientific study of racial characteristics and social hierarchies. These organizations provided intellectual cover for activities that ranged from the merely cruel to the genuinely sadistic, always justified by elaborate theories about the natural superiority of the white race and the corresponding need to maintain strict discipline over inferior peoples. Benjamin had embraced these ideas with the enthusiasm of someone who found in them permission to indulge impulses that might otherwise have been constrained by social convention or religious teaching. The young man who returned to Magnolia Grove in late 1862 was therefore not merely indifferent to the suffering of slaves but actively excited by opportunities to demonstrate his power over them. He had developed a particular interest in what he called educational discipline, punishments designed not merely to correct specific behaviors but to reinforce fundamental lessons about hierarchy and submission. The drowning of Elena's children represented the culmination of a series of increasingly bold experiments in this area, each one testing the limits of what he could do without facing serious consequences from his father or the law. Benjamin's greatest mistake was in assuming that his victims would remain passive in the face of his cruelties, that slaves would accept whatever treatment he chose to inflict with the resigned submission that he had been taught to expect from inferior beings. He had never considered the possibility that someone like Elena might possess the intelligence, knowledge, and determination necessary to plan and execute sophisticated revenge against those who had wronged her. In his mind, slaves were incapable of complex planning or delayed gratification, responding only to immediate rewards and punishments without any capacity for long-term strategic thinking. This fundamental misunderstanding of the people he oppressed would prove to be Benjamin's fatal flaw, the blind spot that would prevent him from recognizing the danger that was growing in his own kitchen even as Elena prepared to serve him the last meal he would ever eat. His inability to see slaves as fully human had made him incapable of imagining that they might possess the very qualities of intelligence and determination that he most prided himself on, qualities that Elena was even then turning toward the problem of how to make him pay for the innocent blood on his hands. The other Whitmore children, Sophia, Catherine, and James, had each found their own ways of participating in and benefiting from the system that had claimed Elena's children, though their guilt was perhaps less direct than that of their parents and eldest brother. Sophia had embraced her role as future mistress of another plantation, preparing for a life in which she would wield the same kind of power over human lives that her mother had exercised, but with less of Victoria's studied ignorance about the realities of slave ownership. She had made it clear that she intended to be a more hands-on manager than her mother, involving herself directly in decisions about punishment and discipline in ways that would ensure maximum efficiency and productivity. Catherine's artistic sensibilities had led her to develop an aesthetic theory of slavery that she found more palatable than crude assertions of racial superiority, arguing that the institution represented a form of organic social harmony in which each race contributed its natural gifts to the creation of a beautiful and orderly society. This intellectual framework allowed her to maintain her self-image as a sensitive and thoughtful person while supporting a system of brutal exploitation, since she had convinced herself that slavery was not oppression but rather a kind of collaborative art project in which everyone played their assigned role for the greater good. Young James represented perhaps the most dangerous evolution of the plantation mentality, since he had grown up entirely within the slave system and had never known a world in which white supremacy was not taken for granted as a natural law. His cruelties were not the calculated experiments of someone like Benjamin, but rather the casual expressions of someone who had never learned to see slaves as anything other than objects for his entertainment. James tortured small animals and terrorized slave children not out of any particular malice but simply because these activities seemed to him as natural and appropriate as any other form of play. As Elena contemplated the guest list for the Easter dinner, she understood that each of these individuals had contributed in their own way to creating and maintaining the system that had murdered her children. Some bore direct responsibility for specific acts of violence, while others were guilty of the more subtle but equally deadly crime of making such violence seem normal and acceptable. All of them had benefited from the exploitation of enslaved labor, and all of them had chosen to remain willfully ignorant of the true costs of their comfortable lives. The approaching Easter celebration would bring together not just the Whitmore family but also their closest friends and associates, people who shared their values and supported their way of life through their presence and participation in plantation society. Judge Robert Ashford, William's father, had built his legal career on defending the property rights of slave owners and had written numerous opinions that strengthened the legal foundations of slavery in Georgia. Dr. Charles Brennan had provided medical cover for countless acts of violence against slaves, writing reports that transformed obvious murders into unfortunate accidents and treating slave injuries with a casual indifference that he would never have shown toward white patients. Reverend Samuel Morrison represented perhaps the most insidious form of complicity, since he used his religious authority to provide divine sanction for human bondage, preaching sermons that portrayed slavery as part of God's plan for organizing human society and teaching slaves that submission to their masters was a form of Christian virtue. His presence at the Easter dinner would add a layer of religious significance to Elena's plans, since she intended to provide a very different kind of religious instruction about divine justice and the ultimate accountability of those who oppressed the innocent. As Elena moved through her daily routines in the weeks following her children's burial, she found herself studying each of these individuals with the careful attention of a scientist examining specimens under a microscope. She observed their habits and preferences, their strengths and vulnerabilities, their relationships with each other and their positions within the complex social hierarchy of plantation society. Each piece of information she gathered became part of a larger puzzle that she was assembling in her mind, a comprehensive understanding of her enemies that would allow her to strike at them with maximum effectiveness when the time came for action. The transformation that had begun in Elena the night her children died was now approaching completion, as the grieving mother evolved into something far more dangerous, a woman with a plan that would bring justice to those who thought themselves beyond the reach of consequences for their crimes against humanity. The Easter dinner that Victoria Whitmore was planning as a celebration of resurrection and renewal would indeed mark a kind of rebirth, but not the kind that anyone expected, as Elena prepared to demonstrate that even the most powerless could find ways to hold the powerful accountable for their sins against innocent children who had never harmed anyone in their brief bright lives. The knowledge that would ultimately seal the fate of 16 souls on Easter Sunday had been accumulating in Elena's mind since her childhood, passed down through generations of women who understood that survival sometimes required more than mere endurance. When Mama Esperanza had first begun teaching Elena about the plants that grew wild in the Georgia countryside, she had emphasized that such knowledge was never to be taken lightly, that the power to heal inevitably carried with it the power to harm, and that both capabilities demanded the highest levels of responsibility and wisdom from those who wielded them. The lessons had begun innocuously enough, with instruction in the preparation of common remedies for everyday ailments that plagued the slave quarters. Elena had learned to brew teas from willow bark that could ease headaches and reduce fevers, to prepare poultices from comfrey leaves that would speed the healing of cuts and bruises, and to create tonics from various roots and berries that could strengthen the constitution and improve resistance to disease. These were skills that any plantation cook might legitimately possess, knowledge that would be seen as beneficial rather than dangerous by the white families who employed them. But as Elena had demonstrated her aptitude for botanical studies and her ability to keep secrets, Mama Esperanza had gradually introduced her to more complex and dangerous applications of plant knowledge. There were herbs that could induce sleep so profound that a person might not wake for hours, leaving them vulnerable to whatever fate their enemies might choose to inflict. There were berries that could cause violent illness without leaving obvious traces of their consumption, making it appear that the victim had succumbed to natural causes rather than deliberate poisoning. Most dangerous of all, there were combinations of plants that could kill slowly and painfully, mimicking the symptoms of common diseases while ensuring that the victim suffered appropriately for whatever crimes they might have committed. The old woman had been careful to frame these lessons as theoretical knowledge rather than practical instruction, emphasizing that such information was part of Elena's heritage as a woman whose ancestors had understood the secrets of the natural world long before European colonizers had arrived to impose their own limited understanding of medicine and healing. Mama Esperanza had stressed that this knowledge was never to be used lightly or for petty grievances, but only in cases where conventional justice had failed, and where the survival of the community might depend on the removal of those who threatened it with their cruelty or violence. Elena had absorbed these teachings with the serious attention of a dedicated student, but she had never imagined that she would one day find herself in circumstances that might require their application. The knowledge had remained dormant in her mind for years, surfacing only occasionally when she encountered plants in the wild that Mama Esperanza had described or when she heard stories of mysterious illnesses that had befallen particularly cruel overseers or masters on distant plantations. She had understood that such knowledge existed as a form of insurance, a final resort that might be necessary if all other forms of resistance proved inadequate. The murder of her children had transformed this theoretical knowledge into something immediate and urgent, a toolkit for justice that Elena now studied with the focused intensity of a scholar preparing for the most important examination of her career. She began making careful expeditions to the marshy areas at the edges of the plantation, where many of the most potent plants grew in the rich, dark soil that fed on decades of accumulated organic matter. She collected specimens with the methodical precision of a scientist, carefully documenting the location and condition of each plant, and noting the optimal times for harvesting different parts of each species. The oleander bushes that grew along the plantation's ornamental gardens provided one of Elena's most reliable sources of deadly alkaloids, compounds that could cause heart failure when prepared and administered correctly. The plants were common enough that their presence would not be questioned, and the preparation methods were subtle enough that the resulting toxins could be incorporated into food without detectably altering taste or appearance. Elena had tested small amounts on rats and other vermin, confirming both the potency of her preparations and the time delays involved in their effects. Castor bean plants, cultivated on the plantation for their ornamental value and their oil production, offered another source of extremely dangerous compounds that could cause organ failure when consumed in sufficient quantities. The beauty of castor beans lay in their delayed action, which meant that victims might not experience symptoms until hours after consumption, making it difficult to trace their illness back to any specific meal or ingredient. Elena had experimented with different preparation methods, learning to extract and concentrate the active compounds in ways that maximized their lethality while minimizing their detectability. The woods surrounding Magnolia Grove were rich with Jimson weed, a plant that Mama Esperanza had described as particularly suitable for ensuring that enemies experienced appropriate psychological torment before succumbing to their physical symptoms. Jimson weed caused powerful hallucinations and delirium, effects that Elena found grimly appropriate for people who had spent their lives inflicting psychological torture on others. The plant's effects were dose-dependent, meaning that Elena could calibrate the intensity and duration of her victims' suffering based on her assessment of their individual levels of guilt and complicity. Pokeweed, which grew abundantly in the disturbed soils around the slave quarters, provided Elena with compounds that attacked the nervous system, causing paralysis and respiratory failure in carefully calibrated stages. The plant's berries were particularly potent, and their dark color made them ideal for incorporation into rich sauces and gravies where they would be virtually undetectable. Elena had learned to time the effects precisely, ensuring that her victims would experience a gradual loss of motor control that would leave them conscious and aware as their bodies slowly shut down. Perhaps most importantly, Elena had discovered several species of mushrooms in the damp areas near the creek that possessed unique properties for her purposes. These fungi contained compounds that could cause liver and kidney damage that would appear to be the result of natural disease processes, making it unlikely that anyone would suspect deliberate poisoning. The mushrooms could be dried and ground into powder that could be stored indefinitely and incorporated into virtually any dish without altering its flavor or appearance. The genius of Elena's approach lay not just in her knowledge of individual plants and their properties, but in her understanding of how different compounds could be combined to create synergistic effects that would be far more devastating than any single toxin used alone. She had learned to create preparations that would attack multiple organ systems simultaneously, ensuring that even if her victims received medical attention, it would be impossible for doctors to identify and treat all of the different poisons working in their systems at once. More sophisticated still was Elena's recognition that different guests at the Easter dinner would require different approaches based on their individual physiology, their dietary preferences, and the level of suffering that she deemed appropriate for their particular crimes. She had spent weeks observing and cataloging the eating habits of each family member, noting who preferred sweet dishes versus savory ones, who ate large portions versus small ones, and who had sensitive digestion versus robust constitution. This information would allow her to customize each person's fate with the precision of a physician prescribing individualized treatment. For Benjamin, who had directly murdered her children, Elena planned the most elaborate and painful death she could devise, combining compounds that would cause intense physical suffering with others that would create terrifying hallucinations and psychological torment. She wanted him to experience the same terror that her children had felt during their final moments in the flooded cellar, the same helplessness and desperation that they had endured while he walked away laughing at their plight. Colonel Whitmore, whose decision to cover up his son's crime had made him equally culpable in Elena's mind, would receive a different but equally devastating combination of toxins, ones that would cause him to lose control of his bodily functions while remaining conscious enough to understand exactly what was happening to him. Elena wanted him to experience the humiliation of complete helplessness, to understand what it felt like to be at the mercy of someone who viewed him as less than human. Victoria Whitmore, whose willful ignorance had enabled decades of cruelty and oppression, would face compounds that would cause confusion and disorientation, making her final hours a bewildering maze of terror and incomprehension. Elena felt that this was appropriate justice for someone who had spent her life refusing to see the suffering that surrounded her, who would now be forced to confront reality without the protective barriers of denial and selective attention that had shielded her from uncomfortable truths. The other family members and guests would receive graduated punishments that reflected Elena's assessment of their individual levels of responsibility for the system that had destroyed her family. Some would experience relatively quick deaths, while others would endure prolonged suffering that matched the duration and intensity of the pain they had inflicted on others. All would die, but they would not all die equally, since Elena's concept of justice demanded that punishment be proportional to guilt. The technical challenges involved in Elena's plan were considerable, requiring her to prepare multiple different toxic preparations and to develop delivery methods that would ensure each person received exactly the dose intended for them. She had solved these problems through careful study of the planned menu and seating arrangements, identifying specific dishes that would be served to specific individuals and calculating the precise amounts of various compounds needed to achieve her desired effects. Elena had also had to consider the timing of the different toxins' effects, since she needed to ensure that the symptoms would not become apparent until after the meal was complete and the guests had dispersed throughout the house. Too rapid an onset would create panic and potentially allow some victims to escape or receive medical treatment, while too slow an onset might allow evidence to be discovered or suspicions to be aroused. She had calibrated her preparations to begin taking effect approximately 2 hours after consumption, giving her time to complete her tasks and make her escape while ensuring that all of her targets would be beyond help by the time their symptoms became apparent. The psychological preparation required for Elena's plan was perhaps even more demanding than the technical aspects, since she was preparing to commit acts that went against every moral principle she had been taught, and every instinct she possessed as someone who had dedicated her life to nurturing and protecting others. The transformation from cook to killer required Elena to fundamentally restructure her understanding of herself and her role in the world, to embrace a version of justice that existed outside the boundaries of law and conventional morality. Elena found strength for this transformation in her memories of her children, and in her understanding of the broader context of oppression and resistance that defined her existence as an enslaved person. She reminded herself that the legal system had already failed to provide justice for her children's murder, that no court would ever hold Benjamin Whitmore accountable for drowning
3 innocent children, and that the only justice available to her was the kind she could deliver herself. She drew inspiration from stories that Mama Esperanza had told about other women who had found ways to strike back against those who oppressed them, understanding that her actions would be part of a long tradition of resistance that stretched back through generations of her people. The religious dimensions of Elena's plan were also significant, since she had chosen Easter Sunday not merely for its convenience as a social gathering, but for its symbolic significance as a day of resurrection and renewal. Elena saw herself as an instrument of divine justice, bringing consequences to those who had escaped earthly accountability for their crimes against innocent children. She understood that her actions would be seen as criminal by those who survived, but she also believed that a higher authority would recognize the righteousness of her cause and the necessity of her methods. As the weeks passed and Easter approached, Elena found herself entering a state of calm determination that surprised her with its completeness. The grief and rage that had consumed her in the immediate aftermath of her children's deaths had been transmuted into something cooler and more focused, a sense of purpose that gave meaning to her existence and direction to her actions. She was no longer simply Elena the cook or Elena the grieving mother, but Elena the agent of justice, someone who had been chosen by circumstances to balance the scales that conventional society had left permanently tilted in favor of the powerful and cruel. The final week before Easter Sunday found Elena making her last preparations with the methodical precision of a general preparing for a decisive battle. She had tested and retested her preparations, confirming their potency and their stability under storage conditions. She had rehearsed her plan dozens of times in her mind, visualizing each step of the process and preparing for various contingencies that might arise during the execution phase. Most importantly, she had made peace with the consequences of her actions, understanding that there would be no return to her previous life once she had crossed the line from victim to avenger. Miguel had noticed the change in his wife's demeanor during these final days, observing that she seemed to have found a kind of serenity that had been absent since their children's death. He interpreted this as a sign that Elena was finally beginning to heal from her grief, that she was finding ways to move forward despite the magnitude of their loss. He could not have imagined that her newfound peace came not from acceptance of her children's deaths, but from her certainty that their killers would soon join them, that justice would finally be served, even if it had to be delivered by her own hands. The night before Easter Sunday, Elena sat alone in her cabin, surrounded by the carefully prepared compounds that would transform the Whitmore family's celebration into their final meal. She thought about Isabella, Carlos, and little Rosa, remembering their laughter and their dreams for the future that had been stolen from them by the casual cruelty of people who saw them as less than human. She promised them silently that their deaths would not be forgotten, that their killers would pay the full price for their crimes, and that the world would know that even the most powerless could find ways to hold the powerful accountable for their sins against innocent children who had never harmed anyone in their brief, bright lives. Easter Sunday dawned with the kind of crystalline beauty that only Georgia springs could provide, the air crisp and clean from the previous night's gentle rain, and the dogwood trees surrounding Magnolia Grove blooming in clouds of white petals that drifted across the plantation grounds like early snow. The sun rose slowly through a sky painted in soft pastels, casting golden light across the cotton fields and illuminating the Spanish moss that draped the ancient oaks like nature's own cathedral decorations. It was the kind of morning that inspired thoughts of renewal and resurrection, perfectly suited for the most sacred day in the Christian calendar and the elaborate celebration that Victoria Whitmore had been planning for months. Elena had risen before dawn, as was her custom, but this morning carried a weight of finality that distinguished it from every other day of her 19 years. She moved through her cabin with the quiet precision of someone who knew that this would be the last morning she would ever spend in this place, the last time she would see the sunrise through the small window that faced east toward the marshlands where she had gathered the instruments of justice that now waited in carefully labeled containers hidden beneath her kitchen workspace. The transformation that had begun with her children's murder was now complete, and the woman who emerged from the cabin as the church bells of distant Atlanta began calling the faithful to Easter services bore little resemblance to the grief-stricken mother who had discovered 3 small bodies in a flooded cellar 4 weeks earlier. The kitchen that Elena had been her domain for 7 years had been transformed overnight into something approaching a temple. Every surface cleaned and organized with ritualistic precision, every tool and ingredient positioned exactly where it would be needed for the elaborate choreography that lay ahead. She had spent the previous evening in final preparations, reviewing her plans one last time and making small adjustments to account for the specific weather conditions and the slight changes in the guest list that had occurred when Judge Ashford's elderly father had taken ill and would be unable to attend. 16 souls would gather at the Whitmore table instead of the originally planned 17. But Elena's calculations remained sound, since she had prepared for various contingencies and had more than enough of her carefully crafted compounds to accomplish her purposes. The menu for the Easter dinner had been planned with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that made Elena's reputation throughout the county. But today, each dish served a purpose far beyond mere gustatory pleasure. The glazed ham that would serve as the centerpiece of the meal had been prepared with a special marinade that incorporated compounds extracted from pokeweed berries, their dark pigmentation perfectly masked by the rich molasses glaze that would give the meat its traditional Easter appearance. The preparation had required Elena to work through much of the previous night, carefully timing the absorption of the toxic compounds to ensure maximum potency while maintaining the flavor profile that Colonel Whitmore particularly enjoyed. The roasted leg of lamb destined for Judge Ashford's plate had received its own specialized treatment, rubbed with a mixture of herbs that included finely ground oleander. Elena had known from memories recorded in her mother's ancestral books that oleander poisoning would be a particularly agonizing and slow way to die, mimicking the symptoms of heart failure over several hours, providing Judge Ashford with an opportunity to reflect upon his guilt and the life he was about to lose. This particular approach required her to time the dosing precisely, ensuring that sufficient time elapsed between ingestion and the onset of critical symptoms to allow for the full progression of the meal and the appropriate atmosphere of celebration to unfold.
Ground castor beans mixed with traditional seasonings in proportions that would deliver a lethal dose without detectably altering the meat's taste or texture. Elena had tested this particular combination extensively on the plantation's rat population, confirming both its effectiveness and its delayed action, which would ensure that the judge would have time to return to his hotel in Atlanta before the symptoms became apparent, creating confusion about the source of his illness and buying Elena additional time for her escape. The individual portions of roasted duck that would be served to the younger Whitmore children had been prepared with graduated doses of compounds extracted from Jimson weed, calibrated according to Elena's assessment of their relative guilt and complicity in the family's crimes. James, whose casual cruelty had marked him as a future monster in Elena's estimation, would receive the highest concentration, ensuring that his final hours would be filled with the kind of terrifying hallucinations that had haunted Elena's own nightmares since her children's death. Catherine and Sophia would experience less intense but equally fatal doses, their deaths serving as a message about the consequences of benefiting from and perpetuating systems of oppression. The side dishes that would accompany the main courses had been equally carefully prepared, each one incorporating different toxic compounds in ways that would create synergistic effects while appearing to be nothing more than traditional Easter fare. The collard greens had been seasoned with a powder derived from dried oleander leaves, their bitter compounds masked by the traditional fatback and vinegar that gave the dish its characteristic flavor. The sweet potato casserole, a particular favorite of Victoria Whitmore, had been enhanced with extracts from wild mushrooms that would attack her liver and kidneys while creating the illusion of a sudden illness rather than deliberate poisoning. Even the cornbread and biscuits that would be served as accompaniments to the meal had received Elena's special attention, prepared with flour that had been lightly dusted with compounds that would enhance the absorption and effectiveness of the other toxins while contributing their own deadly effects. Elena had learned from Mama Esperanza that the key to successful poisoning lay not in relying on any single compound, but in creating combinations that would overwhelm the victim's system from multiple directions simultaneously, making treatment impossible even if the nature of the illness were somehow discovered. The desserts that would conclude the meal represented the culmination of Elena's artistry, both culinary and lethal.
The coconut cake that had been prepared to celebrate Sophia's engagement contained extracts from several different plants, creating a complex mixture that would ensure the young woman's death while allowing her to experience the full range of symptoms that Elena deemed appropriate for someone who had spent her life learning to view other human beings as property. The peach cobbler that would be served to the male guests incorporated compounds that would cause progressive paralysis, leaving them conscious but helpless as their bodies slowly ceased to function. Perhaps most fitting of all were the mint juleps that Elena had prepared for the evening's digestif, traditional Easter drinks that would provide the final doses of poison needed to ensure that any guests who had somehow survived the earlier courses would not live to see Monday morning. The fresh mint that flavored the drinks had been carefully selected from plants that had grown in soil enriched with Elena's special preparations, creating a final irony in which the very symbols of Southern hospitality and refinement would deliver the ultimate judgment on those who had perverted those traditions in service of cruelty and oppression. As the morning progressed and the guests began arriving at Magnolia Grove, Elena observed their approach from the kitchen window with the detached interest of a scientist watching experimental subjects enter a carefully controlled environment. She noted the fine carriages and well-dressed horses that brought the region's elite to what they imagined would be a celebration of their continued prosperity and social dominance, and she felt a cold satisfaction in knowing that they were arriving for their own funeral, that the elegant clothes they wore and the cheerful conversations they engaged in would soon be replaced by very different scenes of confusion, terror, and ultimately justice. Judge Robert Ashford arrived first, as befitted his status as the father of the groom-to-be, bringing with him his wife Margaret and their younger children in a procession that spoke of wealth and confidence in the future. Elena watched him climb the steps to the main house with the measured dignity of a man who had spent decades dispensing what he considered justice from the bench, never imagining that he was about to receive a very different kind of judgment from someone he would never have recognized as qualified to hold opinions about right and wrong. The irony was not lost on Elena that a man who had built his career on protecting the property rights of slave owners would die from poison prepared by the very type of property he had spent his life defending. Reverend Morrison arrived shortly afterward, his black clerical robes lending an appropriately funereal tone to the proceedings as he blessed the gathering and offered prayers for the continued prosperity of families whose wealth had been built on the suffering of others. Elena found it particularly fitting that a man who had preached submission and acceptance to generations of slaves would experience his own final submission to forces beyond his control, that his last sermon would be delivered not from a pulpit but through the agonized gasps and desperate prayers of someone facing divine judgment for his complicity in human oppression. Dr. Charles Brennan's arrival with his wife Dorothy completed the circle of complicity that Elena had identified as worthy of death, since his medical authority had been used repeatedly to cover up acts of violence against slaves and to provide scientific justification for their continued enslavement. Elena had prepared a special fate for the good doctor, ensuring that he would experience the kind of medical mystery that he had helped create so many times for others, that his final hours would be spent in the bewilderment and helplessness that he had inflicted on countless slave families who had watched their loved ones die from unexplained illnesses that were actually the result of deliberate cruelty. The various relatives and family friends who rounded out the guests list each carried their own burden of guilt that Elena had weighed and measured in the weeks leading up to this day. Some had been directly involved in acts of violence against slaves, while others had simply chosen to look the other way and benefit from the system that allowed such cruelty to thrive.
Other way when such acts occurred, but all had benefited from and supported a system that treated human beings as commodities, to be bought, sold, and disposed of according to the whims of their owners. Elena had determined that such complicity warranted death, and she had prepared their fates accordingly. The Easter service that preceded the dinner was conducted in the small chapel on the plantation grounds, with Reverend Morrison delivering a sermon about resurrection and renewal that took on unintended significance given what Elena knew lay ahead for his audience. She listened to his words about divine justice and eternal judgment, while putting the finishing touches on the meal that would deliver both to those who had escaped earthly accountability for their crimes. The hymns that the congregation sang about mercy and forgiveness echoed hollowly in Elena's ears as she considered the absence of mercy that had been shown to her children, and the forgiveness that would never be possible for those who had murdered innocents.
Her children's deaths had finally been answered. The first symptoms began appearing exactly as Elena had calculated, starting with Colonel Whitmore's complaint of sudden nausea, followed quickly by similar distress from several other guests. Within minutes, the elegant dinner party had transformed into a scene of chaos and confusion, with people rushing to assist the increasingly ill guests while desperately trying to understand what could have caused such a sudden outbreak of illness among so many people simultaneously. Dr. Brennan's attempts to diagnose and treat the rapidly deteriorating condition of his fellow guests provided Elena with a final moment of grim satisfaction, as she observed the man who had covered up so many slave deaths struggling helplessly to save the lives of his friends and associates. His medical training was useless against the combination of toxins that Elena had employed, and his growing panic as patient after patient failed to respond to treatment served as a fitting conclusion to a career built on providing false medical cover for acts of deliberate cruelty. Benjamin's particular symptoms unfolded exactly as Elena had planned, with the Jimson weed compounds creating terrifying hallucinations that left him screaming about children's voices calling to him from dark places, about small hands reaching up from floodwaters, about the sound of desperate scratching against wooden walls that no one else could hear. His final hours were filled with the same terror that Isabella, Carlos, and Rosa had experienced during their last moments, and Elena felt that this was entirely appropriate justice for someone who had murdered innocents and shown no remorse for his crimes. As the magnitude of the disaster became apparent and messengers were dispatched to summon additional medical help from Atlanta, Elena quietly slipped away from the chaos she had created. She moved through the plantation grounds with the silent grace of someone who had spent years learning to be invisible to those who considered her merely part of the landscape, making her way toward the marshlands where she had gathered the tools of her revenge and where she would now begin the journey toward whatever freedom might be possible for someone who had chosen to become an agent of justice rather than remain a passive victim of oppression. The last thing Elena heard as she disappeared into the darkness beyond Magnolia Grove was the sound of church bells in distant Atlanta, still calling the faithful to Easter evening services, where they would sing hymns about resurrection and renewal, about divine justice and the ultimate accountability of all souls before a higher power. She walked toward an uncertain future, knowing that she had served as an instrument of that higher power, that she had brought consequences to those who had escaped earthly justice, and that somewhere, in whatever realm awaited them beyond death, 3 small children could finally rest in peace, knowing that their mother had not forgotten them, and that their killers had paid the full price for their crimes against innocent souls who had never harmed anyone in their brief, bright lives. The discovery of 16 bodies scattered throughout the Magnolia Grove mansion on the morning of Easter Monday sent tremors through Georgia society that would be felt for decades to come. Sheriff William Patterson arrived at the plantation shortly after sunrise, summoned by a frantic message from Miguel Marchetti, who had found the main house eerily silent when he came to begin his daily work at the forge. What Patterson encountered defied every category of crime he had previously investigated during his 20 years in law enforcement. A scene of mass death that appeared to have no logical explanation and no obvious perpetrator. The bodies were discovered in various locations throughout the house, some having collapsed in the dining room where they had shared their final meal, Others found in parlors and hallways where they had sought help or comfort in their final moments. The expressions frozen on their faces told stories of confusion, terror, and agony that would haunt the sheriff's dreams for the remainder of his life. Judge Robert Ashford lay curled in a corner of the library, his face contorted in a grimace that suggested he had understood exactly what was happening to him, but had been powerless to prevent it. Dr. Charles Brennan was found in the hallway outside the dining room, his medical bag scattered around him as if he had been attempting to treat himself, even as his own system shut down from compounds he could not identify or counteract. Benjamin Whitmore's body presented the most disturbing sight of all. Discovered in an upstairs bedroom where he had apparently barricaded himself behind furniture in a futile attempt to escape the hallucinations that had consumed his final hours. The room showed signs of a violent struggle, with overturned chairs and shattered mirrors, suggesting that he had been fighting invisible enemies that only he could see. His face bore scratches where his own fingernails had clawed at his skin, and his mouth was frozen open in what appeared to be a permanent scream, as if death had taken him in the middle of calling out for mercy that would never come. Colonel Harrison Whitmore was found seated at his desk in the study, slumped over correspondence that he had apparently been attempting to write when the full effects of Elena's preparations had overtaken him. The half-finished letter, addressed to military authorities in Atlanta, spoke of strange symptoms affecting his family and guests, of a mysterious illness that had struck with unprecedented speed and severity. The handwriting deteriorated visibly as the letter progressed, degenerating from his usual precise script into barely legible scrawls that trailed off into meaningless marks where his motor control had finally failed completely. Victoria Whitmore's body was discovered in her bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of Easter gifts she had been preparing for distant grandchildren, her face wearing an expression of bewildered innocence that spoke of her complete inability to comprehend what was happening to her family. The irony was not lost on Sheriff Patterson that a woman who had spent her life cultivating deliberate ignorance about the realities of slavery had died in a state of confusion about the source of her own destruction, never understanding that her willful blindness had finally been answered with the kind of clarity that only death could provide. The investigation that followed would consume the better part of 6 months and involve officials from the county, state, and eventually federal levels as the scope of the crime became apparent and its implications for regional security were considered. The initial assumption that some form of disease or natural contamination had caused the mass deaths quickly gave way to recognition that this was a deliberate act of mass murder, but the identification of a perpetrator proved frustratingly difficult. Despite extensive inquiries among surviving slaves and neighboring plantation owners, no suspicious characters had been observed in the area, nor was there any evidence of break-in or struggle. A detailed search of the mansion grounds turned up no sign of suspicious contaminants in the food preparation areas or in or around the water sources. The only clue came from several of the victims who had been still alive when aid first arrived from nearby plantations. They spoke of wild hallucinations, with the images of children being particularly prominent. This information led some to suspect that the poisoning had been the work of one of the family's slaves, who had, not uncommonly, been named Wilmer, and had died suddenly some months previously. But police could not find any evidence that any of the remaining slaves had been involved in the crime, and any attempt to confront the slave community found them to be impenetrably tight-lipped.
Identifying the perpetrator and the method proved far more challenging than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the forensic specialist brought in from Augusta to examine the bodies, found evidence of multiple different toxic compounds in the victims' systems, a discovery that ruled out accidental poisoning and pointed towards someone with sophisticated knowledge of lethal plants and their properties. The complexity of the poisoning scheme impressed even Hayes, who had studied similar cases throughout his career and had never encountered anything approaching this level of technical sophistication and careful planning. Each victim had apparently received a different combination of toxins, suggesting that the perpetrator had customized each death according to some personal system of justice that remained opaque to the investigators. The search for Elena Marchetti began within hours of the discovery of the bodies, when household slaves reported that the cook had vanished sometime during the night, along with a few personal possessions. Her reputation for skill and knowledge made her an obvious suspect, but the complexity of the crime seemed to exceed what most investigators believed a 19-year-old slave woman could have planned and executed. The prevailing assumptions about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people made it difficult for many officials to accept that Elena could have single-handedly orchestrated such an elaborate scheme of revenge. Bloodhounds brought in from Savannah tracked Elena's scent to the edge of the marshlands surrounding the plantation, where the trail disappeared into the complex network of waterways and hidden paths that crisscrossed the region. The searchers who followed these routes found evidence of careful preparation, including hidden caches of food and supplies that suggested Elena had been planning her escape for weeks or months. The thoroughness of her preparations impressed even those who pursued her, indicating a level of forethought and strategic thinking that challenged comfortable assumptions about the passive nature of enslaved people. Rewards totaling nearly $1,000 were offered for Elena's capture, dead or alive, making her one of the most wanted fugitives in Georgia history. Posters bearing her description were distributed throughout the South and as far north as Tennessee and Kentucky, warning potential captors that she was extremely dangerous and should not be approached without adequate backup. The bounty hunters and slave catchers who took up the pursuit found themselves chasing a ghost who seemed to have vanished into the landscape as completely as if she had never existed at all. Reports of sightings came in from across the region over the following months, with Elena allegedly spotted in locations ranging from the mountains of North Georgia to the coastal swamps of South Carolina. Most of these proved to be false alarms involving other young black women who bore superficial resemblances to the fugitive, but a few seemed credible enough to warrant serious investigation. A ferry operator near Augusta claimed to have transported a woman matching Elena's description across the Savannah River, while a merchant in Tennessee reported selling supplies to someone who could have been the missing cook. The most intriguing lead came from a conductor on the Underground Railroad operating out of Charleston who reported contact with a young woman possessing detailed knowledge of poisonous plants and their applications. This individual had apparently provided valuable assistance to other fugitives by teaching them to identify and prepare natural remedies for illnesses, but had also shared darker knowledge about plants that could be used for protection against pursuers who meant them harm. The conductor described her as intelligent and determined, but haunted by recent losses, someone who carried herself with the quiet dignity of a person who had found peace through the delivery of justice. Whether this woman was Elena Marchetti or someone else entirely could never be established with certainty, but the description fit well enough to fuel speculation that the Magnolia Grove cook had not only escaped her pursuers but had found ways to help other enslaved people in their own struggles for freedom. The idea that Elena might have transformed her knowledge of deadly plants into a tool for assisting the Underground Railroad added another layer of complexity to her legacy, suggesting that her act of revenge against the Whitmore family had only been the beginning of a longer campaign against the institution of slavery itself. The impact of the Magnolia Grove massacre extended far beyond the immediate circle of victims and their families, sending shockwaves through Georgia society that fundamentally altered the relationship between enslaved people and their owners throughout the region. The realization that a cook could systematically poison an entire dinner party without detection forced plantation families to confront the uncomfortable truth that their most trusted household servants possessed both the knowledge and the access necessary to kill them at any time they chose to do so. The paranoia that followed Elena's escape manifested itself in dramatic changes to household management practices throughout the South. Many prominent families dismissed their slave cooks entirely, hiring free whites or indentured servants despite the significantly higher costs involved. Those who continued to employ enslaved cooks implemented elaborate security measures, including the hiring of food tasters, the installation of locked spice cabinets, and the requirement that all meals be prepared under the direct supervision of white overseers. The social gatherings that had once been central to Southern elite culture became increasingly rare and tense affairs, with hosts and guests alike displaying obvious anxiety about the safety of shared meals. The gracious hospitality that had long been a hallmark of plantation society began to give way to suspicious scrutiny of every dish, every seasoning, every unfamiliar ingredient that might conceal deadly compounds. The very foundations of Southern social life had been undermined by Elena's demonstration that those who served could also be those who judged and executed. Religious leaders throughout the region struggled to make sense of the theological implications of the Magnolia Grove massacre, with many sermons addressing the question of whether divine justice could work through instruments as unlikely as an enslaved cook seeking revenge for her murdered children. Some ministers argued that the deaths represented God's judgment on families who had perverted Christian teachings to justify human bondage, while others maintained that Elena's actions were simply criminal and that no religious significance should be attached to them. The debate over Elena's moral status divided communities throughout the South, with some arguing that she was a symbol of resistance, human dignity, and ethical principle, while others condemned her as a murderous criminal. The turbulent fate of Elena Marchetti became a focal point for debates about the nature of justice and the limits of moral accountability in a society riven by racial oppression. Congregations challenged comfortable assumptions about the relationship between earthly and divine justice. Those who saw her as an agent of God's wrath pointed to biblical precedents involving unlikely instruments of divine judgment, while those who condemned her actions argued that murder could never be justified, regardless of the provocation or the worthiness of the victims. The theological controversy added another dimension to Elena's legend, elevating her from a simple criminal fugitive to a figure whose actions raised fundamental questions about justice, revenge, and moral accountability. The legal ramifications of the case extended beyond the immediate search for Elena to encompass broader questions about the rights and responsibilities of enslaved people under Georgia law. Prosecutors struggled with the unprecedented nature of a mass murder committed by a slave against multiple white victims, since existing legal frameworks provided little guidance for handling such cases. The complexity of the crime and the sophistication required to plan and execute it challenged basic assumptions about the mental capabilities of enslaved people that underpinned the entire legal structure of slavery. Defense attorneys, who specialized in representing slaves in capital cases, found themselves studying the Elena Marchetti situation as a potential precedent for future cases involving enslaved defendants accused of violence against their owners. The question of whether Elena's actions could be classified as justified resistance rather than criminal murder opened new avenues for legal arguments that had previously been considered impossible or unthinkable. Even those who condemned her methods had to acknowledge that her grievances against the Whitmore family were legitimate and that conventional legal channels had provided no avenue for redressing the murder of her children. The investigation into Elena's background revealed the extent to which knowledge and education had been passed down through informal networks within the slave community, challenging assumptions about the intellectual isolation that slavery was supposed to impose on its victims. The discovery that Elena could read and write, that she had access to botanical knowledge that rivaled that of trained physicians, and that she had maintained correspondence with contacts throughout the region painted a picture of enslaved communities that were far more sophisticated and connected than white society had realized. This revelation prompted new restrictions on slave literacy and communication throughout Georgia and neighboring states, as authorities sought to prevent the emergence of other figures like Elena who might combine education with grievances to deadly effect. The irony that Elena's actions had prompted measures that would make life harder for all enslaved people was not lost on those who understood the complex dynamics of resistance and repression, but it also demonstrated the lasting impact that one person's quest for justice could have on an entire system of oppression. The economic consequences of the Magnolia Grove massacre extended throughout the regional agricultural economy as insurance companies began refusing to provide coverage for plantation owners and banks became reluctant to extend credit for agricultural operations that might be vulnerable to similar attacks.
The cotton market experienced temporary disruptions as investors worried about the stability of plantation labor systems, while the slave trade itself was affected by increased scrutiny of the backgrounds and capabilities of individuals being sold. Some plantation owners responded to these concerns by attempting to improve conditions for their enslaved workers, reasoning that better treatment might reduce the likelihood of violent resistance. Others moved in the opposite direction, implementing harsher discipline and more restrictive conditions in the belief that Elena's actions proved the need for stricter control over slave populations. Both approaches reflected recognition that the comfortable assumption of slave passivity had been permanently shattered by Elena's demonstration of what one determined individual could accomplish when pushed beyond the limits of endurance. The Magnolia Grove Plantation itself never recovered from the massacre, becoming a symbol of the vulnerability of even the most successful slave-owning families to the consequences of their treatment of enslaved people. Miguel Marchetti was eventually sold to a plantation in Alabama, where he lived quietly until his death in 1871, never remarrying and never speaking publicly about his wife or her actions on Easter Sunday, 1863. The other surviving slaves were dispersed to various owners throughout Georgia, carrying with them stories about Elena's revenge that would be passed down through generations as both warning and inspiration. The plantation buildings stood empty for several years after the massacre, as no buyer could be found willing to risk the association with such notorious events. Local residents reported strange occurrences around the abandoned structures, including unexplained sounds and lights that some attributed to the restless spirits of Elena's victims seeking peace that would never come. Whether these phenomena had any basis in reality or were simply products of guilty consciences and overactive imaginations, they contributed to the plantation's reputation as a cursed place where the normal rules of social hierarchy had been violently overturned. When the plantation was finally sold in 1867, it was to northern investors who had no connection to its history and who planned to convert the property to different uses entirely. The main house was demolished and the land subdivided for small farming operations that would be worked by free laborers rather than slaves. The destruction of the physical structures that had witnessed Elena's revenge marked the end of an era, but the memory of what had occurred there continued to resonate throughout the region for decades to come. The search for Elena Marchetti continued sporadically for several years after the massacre, but as time passed and no credible sightings were reported, most authorities concluded that she had either died during her escape attempt or had successfully reached free territory where she could not be pursued. The mystery of her ultimate fate became part of her legend, with various stories emerging about her possible survival and continued activities in support of other fugitive slaves. Some accounts placed her in Canada, where she allegedly worked with other refugees from slavery to establish communities for those seeking freedom from the South. Others suggested that she had remained in the United States, moving from place to place and using her knowledge of poisonous plants to protect underground railroad stations from discovery by hostile authorities. A few stories claimed that she had joined formal military units fighting for the Union during the continued Civil War, using her expertise in poisons as a form of unconventional weaponry against Confederates.
Against the Confederacy, serving as a scout or spy who used her skills to gather intelligence about Southern military operations. The truth about Elena's post-massacre life may never be known with certainty, but the persistence of these various accounts demonstrates the lasting impact that her actions had on both the enslaved communities that saw her as a hero and the white communities that feared her as a dangerous criminal. Her transformation from grieving mother to avenging angel had created a legend that transcended the specific circumstances of her case and came to represent broader themes of resistance, justice, and the ultimate accountability of those who oppressed others. The civil war that was raging during Elena's escape provided cover for many fugitive slaves seeking freedom in the chaos of military conflict, and it is entirely possible that she found ways to disappear into the confusion of wartime population movements. The Union Army's policies regarding escaped slaves created opportunities for people like Elena to find protection and new identities that would have been impossible during peacetime. Whether she took advantage of these opportunities or met some other fate during her flight from Georgia remained one of the enduring mysteries of her story. As the years passed and the immediate fear generated by the Magnolia Grove massacre began to fade, Elena's actions were increasingly seen as a harbinger of the changes that would ultimately transform Southern society through the abolition of slavery and the destruction of the plantation system. Her demonstration that enslaved people possessed both the intelligence and the determination to strike back against their oppressors prefigured the broader resistance that would contribute to the eventual collapse of the institution that had claimed her children's lives. The legacy of Elena Marchetti extended far beyond the specific circumstances of her revenge against the Whitmore family, becoming part of the larger narrative of resistance and liberation that defined the experiences of enslaved people throughout American history. Her story served as both inspiration and warning, demonstrating that even the most powerless individuals could find ways to demand justice when conventional channels failed them, but also illustrating the terrible costs that such justice might require. In the decades that followed the Civil War and the formal abolition of slavery, Elena's story was remembered and retold in various forms throughout the African American communities of Georgia and beyond. Some versions emphasized her role as a loving mother, driven to desperate measures by the murder of her children, while others focused on her skills as a healer and herbalist who turned her knowledge toward darker purposes when justice demanded it. All versions agreed that she had demonstrated the kind of courage and determination that had enabled enslaved people to survive and ultimately overcome the system that had oppressed them. The question of whether Elena's actions constituted justice or revenge continued to provoke debate among those who heard her story, with different communities and individuals reaching different conclusions based on their own experiences and moral frameworks. Those who had suffered under slavery or its aftermath were more likely to see her as a hero who had struck a blow against oppression, while those who benefited from existing power structures were more inclined to view her as a criminal whose actions threatened the stability of society. Perhaps the most fitting memorial to Elena Marchetti was not any physical monument or written account, but rather the changes in behavior and attitude that her actions had prompted among both the oppressed and their oppressors. The fear that she had instilled in plantation families had contributed to a recognition that their power was not absolute, that those they had treated as property possessed the capacity for resistance that could not be permanently suppressed. The inspiration that she had provided to other enslaved people had demonstrated that individual acts of courage could have consequences far beyond their immediate circumstances. The Easter Sunday that had begun as a celebration of resurrection and renewal had indeed marked a kind of rebirth, though not the kind that anyone had anticipated when they gathered around the Whitmore family's dinner table. Elena's transformation from cook to avenger had created ripples that spread throughout Southern society, challenging assumptions, inspiring resistance, and ultimately contributing to the larger forces that would bring about the end of slavery itself. Her children's deaths had been answered not just with the deaths of their killers, but with changes that would prevent other children from suffering similar fates at the hands of those who saw them as less than human. The story of Elena Marchetti remains one of the most complex and morally ambiguous episodes in the history of American slavery, a tale that resists simple categorization as either heroic resistance or criminal violence. Her actions on Easter Sunday, 1863, demonstrated both the depths of human love and the terrible consequences of systematic oppression, showing how ordinary people could be transformed into agents of extraordinary change when pushed beyond the limits of what they could endure. Whether she found freedom in the end or died in pursuit of it, Elena had already achieved a kind of immortality through her demonstration that even the most powerless could find ways to hold the powerful accountable for their crimes against innocent souls who deserved nothing more than the chance to live, love, and grow in peace. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.